So here we go. Amazing. Welcome, everyone. This is a new episode of the Sounds Like Sustainability Conversations. And I'm very, very excited and happy that Laura is here. And Laura, we will introduce you in a second. I will just mention that this series of conversations is a little collaboration project where we bring together people from a European background, from the universities here, with people in this IECA network, which is the International Environmental Communication Association, for everyone who's interested. And this conversation will be recorded so everyone can listen to it. However, it's wonderful to see a couple of people here because we will have about 25-30 minutes of a conversation between Laura and me and myself, and then from there we will open up this conversation for discussion. So everyone who wants to join in, ask questions, talk about their projects and their experiences related to the topic. I'm very, very happy to have, as I said, an open conversation then after we start. So let's get started. And there's one question that I sometimes ask at the beginning, because the title is something we can play around with. Sounds like sustainability, ... So we know that there are a lot of things that sound like sustainability, but they potentially aren't. So I'm wondering, if we're all quiet, if there's any sound that we can hear that reminds us of sustainability, anything we connect with our idea, our, I don't know, associations around sustainability. Is there anything, Laura, that you can hear around you?
Well, for me, at the moment, I'm hearing unsustainable sounds because there's some construction around me. But I have a big park next to my house where I run, and it's away from the street. And when I hear the birds and the leaves rattle as I step on them, for me, that sounds like an ecosystem, like, sustainability, like this like beautiful balance of many things occurring at the same time and many processes happening at the same time, leaves falling, perhaps, other animals going through different processes. I think, hearing multiple things at the same time. And I think a lot about sustainability actually in those sorts of environments. Similarly, in the canal, sometimes I stop to think about how the water flows, and it also reminds me that sustainability is not something that you can grasp, and maybe that is the thing, that we aim to keep perhaps some balance, but it's not about pinning it what it is. It's actually about the balance.
And this is so hard for us as humans.
Yes.
There's something we can't grasp. But you talked about the canals. Let us take the opportunity and introduce you. I would, you are in the Netherlands, you are in Rotterdam. So
Yes.
can you tell us a bit about who you are and where you are and why you are where you are at the moment?
Yeah, so my name is Laura. I am an assistant professor at the University of Rotterdam, Erasmus University in the Netherlands. And I have a background in communication. I did also my PhD in political sciences, but using a lot of communication theory in Tasmania, in Australia. So I started my journey over there, and then I moved recently to the Netherlands to work on regional and local sustainability development projects. And I've been here for 3 years or so. I say off already that it's a Dutch word, so maybe I'm really like becoming Dutch. But I've been here for 3 years, and I work in the Department of Public Administration, but I really deal with public organizations and their communication, as well as places. So in general, I'm interested on how places and public organizations communicate for sustainability. So not really about what they do, but to enact change through their communication practices.
That's so there are so many words that are absolutely I don't know, that make me a bit excited on the one hand and itchy and achy on the other hand. And I think this is something that sustainability does. Before we dive into thinking about places and those lines to land that can be created through communication, I would love to stick a bit with sustainability and the term and how it's used and how it's sometimes abused. So what is sustainability for you in a nutshell?
Yeah, well, a big question to start off with.
I know.
So I have grappled with this question for a long time myself, and I start always, when you try to write or talk about it, you think, okay, where do I start? The Brundtland report and about sustainable development and how it is about futurity or integrating different generations and making sure we meet the needs of current and future humans. But then I also started grappling with issues about the values underneath what we understand by sustainability. And then I started grappling with this idea, is it about human values only, or is it about something else? And I started looking at what is shaping our thought about development and looking at political economy and how we have been basing our thought on this exchange value of one thing for another. So nowadays, when I think about sustainability, I actually do think about sustainability value because it's easier for me to grasp a little bit what it means. And I think a lot of the time is about this conflict of values we have, and that we tend to think about value only in terms of human value. And I think there is a lot of colleagues doing wonderful work in looking at the non-human aspects of sustainability and bringing those into the conversation. I think you mentioned what sounds like sustainability. And I think that's very important because communication is embodied. And it's not about words only. And then the environment plays even a bigger role, and you can actually start talking about a more systemic approach to understanding the value of a sustainable system, if you like. So I really focus my work around this systemic view of this balance that we mentioned before. And I can talk to you a little bit more in detail of how I see these values if you see fit. But for now, I'll leave it as such, and maybe you can prompt me as you feel fit for this conversation.
Yes. I would love to talk about the values. I would just, before that, I would like to think about something you said. You said communication is always embodied. In what? So
yes.
What do you mean by that? That is super interesting.
Yeah, so we recently did, maybe to be more specific, we are very interested in sustainability narratives and how public organizations construct these narratives and what it means in terms of their actions. So where are the focus and which values, and what does it mean in terms of action, and what's left behind, what is not actioned, right? And as part of this, over the last 30 years, governments have been using branding as a form of selling. But we argue that actually, if you turn it around and you focus on the communicative interactions laying at the base, you can use it as a tool for sustainability in local and regional areas. And what this means is that our narratives are often collective identities turned into narratives. We have history in places, so places are very special. They are public, there are many stakeholders involved. So we have history, we have interactions with people that have lived here from a long time, newcomers, different perceptions of what this place is. We shape it, it's socially constructed, right? And through our communicative interactions, we make place. And the sustainability of the place is really linked to the way in which we make place, and how this space for communication is enabled or disabled, right? So at the higher level, if you think about when these narratives are constructed, you would expect that if more people are engaged, then those narratives will be more sustainable because they would encompass the views of more people. Now, I'm coming to the embodied part, don't you worry. If you have a narrative about a place that doesn't match action, right? You are basically losing the power of that narrative to affect change towards sustainability. We think that when you communicate about a place through branding, sounds like a really marketing term, but we translate it into this kind of narrative framework. Then you have embodied experiences of place. The way you understand a place is not only what you hear, but also what you feel when you go into a park, when you move around the city, the experiences that you have on your own, but with others, and how are they shaped over time. So there are many different planes that contribute to that embodied experience of what a place is. Is your individual identity, the collective identity that for us comes down to what values do we have. And we think this is very powerful because if we're going to talk about sustainability, it's really important to understand how we shape those values with our communication. So we address the top-down communication, the narratives that cities put forward, and we argue for bringing people in so we can, give space for all those experiences to be linked and potentially lead to more action towards sustainability. So at a process level and at an outcome level, we think those narratives are really key for who is in and who is out. And the embodied element, I think, is what we use to kind of talk through with governments or local officials that the way you construct this narrative, you cannot control it because it gets mediated, embodied, etc., in those interactions between people. And then we can open a little bit of space for their understanding of this kind of idea that you can't really shape it on your own, right? And if you think about digital spaces even more, it doesn't mean that the embodiment has to happen in a physical space, but it happens. You pull from previous experiences to try to understand what a place means. That's how this kind of links together in our view.
So what I really like is the connection between this two aspects of a narrative. A very kind of abstract one that is reflected in some strategic communication and branding and marketing, or in the media, local newspaper. That's kind of a co-creation that is happening there. By the same time, the physical elements, the actual place, the parks, the houses, the environment. And do you see, do you have any experiences from your projects how these two levels can be connected? Because you said, it's really problematic if that narrative runs off and if you're like, oh, okay, so there's no match. So we know about the problems and then the abuse of sustainability narratives that people don't feel connected to or embodied, but how to make it happen?
Yeah, good question. I wish I had a straight answer, but I can give you some pointers of what we think is useful in this space. We often also talk about stories and how people can relate to stories more than perhaps narratives or brands, and that brands should be multivocal, so accommodate all these different stories. And when we go to do some work on this, I'm an action researcher, which means that I go to the field and I try to do research that also encourages collective action. So in my work, recently I worked in a European Union project looking at regional development, sustainable regional development, and we proposed that we would do a process whereby we work with a group of citizens, so representative of as much as possible of all different levels, so more rural areas, more closer to urban areas, all genders, abilities, etc. And we get them through a process whereby they shape a collective identity. How does this relate to sustainability or to those ideas of affecting the narratives? We worked with an organization to do this work before they developed their regional development plan. So what this means is that a prior step to developing sustainable development policies or plans should really be, what is this community heading towards? What are their values? How do we ensure that we keep them moving forward, right? So the work that we do is to start talking to them in a very open and reflective process that goes across 2 or 3 focus groups discussions normally about how do they view this place. So we don't even throw the word sustainability in. What's interesting about this process is that we expect, of course, power dynamics. We expect to see how those values shape and in those interactions. And at the very beginning, people have very strong understandings of what this place is, how it should develop, right? And then as you go, you see that at the very least, people start to find compromises. And where those compromises start to happen is when place becomes this more embodied, or when they start to have this more emotional, if you like, discussion about what place means to them. And then you're touching upon the values. So some of them started saying, well, we have a resource here for tourism, so we should great people here, but sustainable tourism, you know, what does that mean? But then others started saying, but what this means to me is when my children can run free on the street. Mm-hmm. When I can, you know, all of a sudden create a space for a workshop, and then people come together in a very organic way and we discuss what can we do in this park, or how can we clean it up, or that's what it means to me. And then when those conversations start to happen, then we can talk about, okay, what are really the things that you want to protect? And it's not about physical things. The social, the cultural, that often gets overlooked a little bit in this conversation, it's really key. And then they talk about this, what are my roots? How would I want to keep that? And that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be culturally the same forever. It means that there are some elements that bring us together, and those should be translated into those sustainable development plans. Because that's the base of how you can rally a community to bind and to join forces for action. Mm-hmm. So they started even towards the end, started to collaborate. Okay, we should like envisioning real action, like why don't we create a network whereby there are tourism experiences, they come to my place and stay with me, but then you show them your olive oil that you're growing. This was in Spain, for example, that you grow. And then we go and visit this area where the elders can talk about how they used to farm, and then you have your farm to fork experiences, but they came up with it. If they have this love for the place as a binding stone and what it means to them and how it binds them. So that's really like a touch and feel, not only like, you know, an abstract way of thinking of place. So the experiences that they were describing were really touch and feel experiences. Then you can move to, okay, to keep this going, what do we need to do? And then you get not only a commitment towards a goal, but also you get actors rallied to kind of deliver to the goal. And there's still conflict. There will be people that won't agree. Mm-hmm. But
why? Like, what are those conflicts from your experiences?
Yeah, I think we see also that in rural and regional areas in particular, there are areas that are pressured because young people are leaving, they need economic growth to survive. That's how they would put it, survival. Which survival, by the way, was also a common value. Being able to keep this, to survive in this context in which we are facing that our older people are dying, they're not working on the fields anymore. We have to help young people come back, but what kinds of jobs? You know, all these things. But some of them will say, no, the tourists are the only way. They come, the Dutch, for example, we mentioned, the Dutch come and buy our olive oil, double the price that someone that, you know, from here. And then others would say, but yeah, why do we have to buy it? Why don't we start trading? And you see that you start seeing like how people can think differently when you care about the people. Like in that space, we didn't really, I mean, the space became someone in a way, if I can put it. So the space, this place that we all love. There's a word in Valencian, which is a variety of Catalan, terreta. It's like eta at the end is something small, like cute. And terreta means earth, the earth, but maybe the territory in which we live, this small piece of land. And when they say la terreta, it's really refers to this. It's like saying Mother Earth. But when you say, you know, they really refer to it with an emotional attachment with this. And I am actually from that area originally, so I had to work on my positionality fair a bit. But also I do understand how they see it in this way. And of course, language, again, communication, those words are loaded and mean a lot. But I think I diverted a bit from your question, but
No. I love that. I think that's something else that I find fascinating, because and this is something else where I feel the biggest challenges in sustainability communication, or communicating about sustainability or for sustainability, the biggest challenge is exactly in what you just said in the words. And then this is such an abstract concept anyway. Principle of value, a guiding principle of action, like how I want to frame it. And plus it's an English term, and it's so abstract, and it's not connected to those little words that people say in a specific region, in a specific language area. And of course, kind of being in between two languages as well, there are so many words in German that I feel like, oh my God, they're such a good fit, but I can't possibly translate them into English, but vice versa. And because, like, for example, the notion of care, it's something that doesn't really translate into German in the same way, in this multifold of aspects of care. I care about, care for, because I care about. And playing around with this, that doesn't work in German. So I feel like, oh, damn it. So, and the same with like Spanish and so many other languages on this world. So that is really interesting. Before we go, like, maybe a bit more into the space of communication and potential strategies to do things better, I would love to jump back to the values and this idea of values, and kind of this notion of care is something that is there, because if you care about something, you take care of and you care for, so you protect, or you are aware that this is important. And this leads back to my very own values. And you said something like, oh, sustainability is a value, or it has the potential to become like a universal value, or maybe it is a value that's already there, it's just not framed as sustainability. So what are your experiences with this kind of value or idea of value?
Yeah, so when we looked at it from more a theoretical perspective, so the idea was to map out values in communications, strategic communications plans, or local development or urban development plans. We started thinking about, like I said, looking at political economy ideas of what value is. So if you think about when we communicate, what are we passing on, or what's a dominant way in which we look at something? And of course, I mentioned exchange value because, you know, globalization has brought this pervasive idea of the neoliberal kind of approach to development, where it's about growth, it's about economic exchange, and that's, if you look at a system, an environment, a place, because we tend to look to places like that. Most of my work is about place and how we talk about it. Then there are other elements on it that are values as well. So for instance, we also think about the labor value of things. What does it take to make something, right? So think about a piece of wood and how you transform it into a spear for hunting, right? There's a process there, mental process, and there's also like a craft of doing it. And on top of that, there's also the use value of something that something can have. So water is a good in itself, right? Similarly, history has use value, is there for us, it defines who we are. Those are things that exist and have value per se, almost, right? And then beyond that, we thought, okay, but there is a function value of things that is not based on exchange. It's the value of a thing has to the larger system in which it operates. So a bee as a pollinator, 1 bee is probably not very valuable, right? If a bee dies, okay, but the system of bees pollinating is what keeps us going, right? So we thought, if you want to talk about sustainability, it is important that you think about this, right? That you think about a place and what are you considering of value. And that was at a higher level, right? When we brought it to the level of how, the higher level, I mean the strategic sustainable development plans of, for example, a region or a city or something like this. But then when we bring it down to how can we bottom up, create a space where people can collaborate and people don't necessarily think so strategically, right? How can we talk about value in terms of sustainability value? Okay, we can open up space for discussing these alternative forms of value that are not there. So when they talk about, I love the way in which we have different towns, one next to the other, and we have differences in language. So difference becomes something that has use value in itself, right? I wouldn't like to everybody to speak my own language. Then that becomes important. And when it becomes of value and important, then it's worth being kept. And then you can move the conversation from exchange value. If we all talk the same language, a transaction would be easier. I'm putting it very simply here. To there is value, even though it's going to be more difficult to bring up economic development. There is value in keeping all these things because they make us who we are in a way. So this collective identity and the values that lie within are often, wider than looking at value in terms of what can we do to bring development to this area. And to be quite frank, we've been saying sustainability value, but in those conversations, they say maybe we should stop saying development and start talking about degrowth. They said it, not me. The participants started thinking about, but maybe what we need is not really to bring people, to bring economic opportunity. Maybe what we need is to work on this plan so we kind of have alternative ways of dealing with this place and us and keeping it. And I think that's very interesting because that brings a little bit of openness in how we understand sustainability. It's not about maintaining the status quo. It actually begins to go towards more regenerative ideas and more, not going forward, but maybe on a temporal line. Maybe it also means to stop and look back at the very least. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds amazing. So before we open up this, oh gosh, I'm like thinking about so many places and experiences and kind of little the consequences of that, because that is so it is amazing. And just before I open up the discussion for any other questions of the people joining us today, one last question. What role does communication play in that? So if we look at communication from, I say very carefully, from a strategic point of view, something that we can somehow manage or at least somehow guide.
Yeah.
I can, like, one thing that I heard very clearly is how important it is to create collective identity before you jump in. So to create groups, to create those connectivities before you then jump in with your plan and your branding and your kind of strategies. So to create collective identity and groups and networks before you actually do that, so that in a prior phase, that is something that I heard. The second thing is that space is needed. A conversational spaces where people can actually talk and negotiate or renegotiate what is important, renegotiate their values. Is there something else or something that is also connected to that can be thought of in regional local development plans, in those sustainability strategies, or in any kind of communication?
Yeah, I think there are two things that are linked. I would put it down to a lack of a public sphere for deliberation. And I think that's why we create these spaces for communication. Basically, what happens in these interventions, as we call them, so when you do action research with these groups, is that we create a space for interaction. And it's a space for communicative interaction, for exchange of ideas that is normally very difficult to recreate. And we are mindful of this because we as researchers maybe bring a neutral space, some call it a third space, and that allows to remove perhaps some of the power dynamics that happens when these sorts of processes may be organized by local governments, for instance. So what we think it's very important is that there is space for communication where deliberation can happen, but also everyone has a legitimate right to participate, and they feel comfortable to participate, and they can express their views. So it's this care for others, this nurturing, we call it brave spaces. That's a technical term we use for the space that we create in those meetings. And we have someone that emphasizes, me as facilitator, whoever facilitates, that occurs. And I think this is key to what sort of communication we need, right? I think establishing the space for that. Also, I believe that due to the changes in the media landscape, just to connect a bit more to media and communications, I think those public spheres are really disappearing, going somewhere else, quite fragmented. And often you get these bubbles where the people that were in the room are in their bubble in the everyday. So if you are in a tourism bubble, you can only think about tourism development in one way. But when you sit those people together with teachers that are working with kids, that are communicating about very different things in the everyday, and you put them together, then something really magical occurs. Because it's not about tourism, it's not about education, it's about us. And I think that's what makes it a little bit of a difference, right? It's very far-fetched to say it's about us, but I'm not saying that it's individuals, it's about us, but it's about we all make this place, for good or for bad. And I remember some of them at the end, because I always ask, so how did you find this process? What did you learn, right? We learn through communicating with each other, learning from each other. First and foremost needs that we hear each other, that we, right? And then they said, at the very least, now I understand his or her position, right? That's the point, to open a little bit of space for this to happen. And unfortunately, there are processes that have to happen in a certain way. So those regional development plans need to be developed. But I think that we have a lot of potential for creating spaces where people can debate, can deliberate, but for that they have to communicate first. You have to break through those impasses, perhaps, where there are silos of people talking about this sustainable development in a very different way. And bringing them together is one way in which you can brokerage those impasses. And also us creating a report on this and sending it back to those organizations and showing them that it's possible and beneficial to do it for those reasons that I gave before. So one, to understand what this collective identity is, but two, if you're going to bind actors together for action, so beyond that strategy, you have to action it, implement it, then you better have them on board. You better have them feeling part of the project, right? So there's these two levels in which communication is very important. It's actually the core of it, we think. And maybe one last thing that I want to throw in the mix is that you mentioned how to manage or strategic communication manage. We've been arguing for a long time that in the case of narratives about place and sustainability, it's uncontrollable. You have activist groups talking different types of development. You have, other areas more entrepreneurial, more focused on economic development. You have a lot of voices. So I think we should be careful about trying to manage it. Maybe we need to adopt, maybe curator is not the word, but some sort of more facilitating interactions rather than rather than managing them. That's maybe wishful thinking more than actually.
Well, like seriously, I'm completely on board with that, and because that's what like I have this ongoing series of interviews with PR people and strategic communicators, and with a colleague in the US in Boulder. And what we've found just 2 years ago is that people increasingly, like those strategic communicators, increasingly perceive themselves as curators of stories or curators of narratives. So there is a change, I think, an increased consciousness that we can't, especially in the kind of non-marketing communication space, that this orchestration or this idea of curating conversations is a very strong concept and is a bit closer to what public relations, what communication management, to express it in a bit of a softer way, means today.
Yeah,
and
but also I think maybe we've been thinking, I say we because in our projects I don't work in isolation. I have colleagues that work on this project with me around Australia, Netherlands. But in this case, we've been thinking a lot about this idea of the role of communicators, because this is also very important. And I think I'm going a little bit sideways here, but thinking about the university, for example. I've been recently engaged in a project about looking at sustainability narratives across the university. And there are strategic plans and there are bottom-up initiatives to collecting what people think sustainability is, or what action should we take. But then communications professionals are in the middle trying to translate this. And their translation affects also action, because I think it's very, the way you frame it, the narrative, yes. And I was very interested on how they see their role. Because they may or may have not been part of the strategic action, but they have to, in a way, communicate to deliver that strategic action. So I think that's for the future. I'm really interested on looking at this role, but I think that curation is certainly something that we overlook in terms of how we create policies and strategies to deliver sustainability and where communication sits. So I think changing the discourse is very important. So the way in which activist groups, maybe non-formal, I don't know how to frame it, groups invite us to think differently about it and change the discourse. I think that's very important, but it's also important to look at how those established discourses are then translated, because I have a feeling that a lot of our colleagues in communications have an intrinsic motivation to support sustainable practices. So how does that play out? I don't know, but that is also very interesting, I think. And I think we need more research on that, or at least I'm not aware of a lot of research on that.
No, because I think it's one reason is probably that communication is still approached with this managerial approach, with this functionalistic perspective on, there's a center of information or knowledge or whatever messages, and they ascend towards a certain object. And this very linear understanding of communication, this information-based process, and therefore functional understanding of communication still dominates a lot of thinking. And I think this kind of, to turn this around in a more critical interpretive perspective that is missing, listening, and what doesn't play such a massive role, internal communication in this area. There's a lot more work on that, and kind of listening and more co-creation processes of meaning making, sense making. Organizational studies are really good in that, much better than Stratcom people are usually. So I think that's one part of it. What I really like is the idea of that there are so many invitations for us to think about the world, projects, a city, whatever, in a different way. And that it's not an either or. It's not either that or the other, but the kind of multitude of narratives, the idea that, things can be like those dominating narratives need to be broken up, and there are alternatives. It's not an empty space. That is really interesting. I don't really want to like carry it away here. Are there any other questions maybe from people in the call, or is there any other aspect that you, Laura, thought like, oh, no, really, just in that context, I would love to talk more about that. So is there any question or any additional thoughts from your side? So Victoria is saying in the chat, I really like the concept of the communication professionals as translators of the narratives, and sustainability as a concept. But what about the communication with other stakeholders, such as business associations, governmental organizations, or NGOs? How to get their engagement when they have their own goal, and it's not always related to sustainability. Yeah, possibly is against it or counter narratives.
Yeah, that's a great question, Victoria. I think two things maybe to add to this. One thing that we haven't mentioned is that the reflective aspect of this, and I think communications professionals as well are there talking but also listening. And we often discuss with public officials in particular this idea that there's no one way communication anymore, is two-way, and if you take it to the embodied experiences and communication, then it's like multi-way, multifaceted. So they are there also listening. They know what happens, where reaction, where counter messages come. They manage this. So they have a lot of knowledge also about what type of communication works and what type of communication does not work and why, and which people have been maybe left out of this conversation, and then they are having a reaction and how to bring them in. And so we don't have a lot of reflective spaces for enabling this. They are left with having to make decisions about how to go about it. So as a manager, I would love to hear all these inputs so I can adapt my strategy to be actually more effective in the end. So if we're going to talk about management of sustainability, which is what organizations do and places do ultimately, because there's no point saying let's not manage it, right? We want to contribute to that conversation. Then we have to really think about, you know, how we translate these fantastic insights and that translating work into the strategic thinking. As like we call it like the double loop, kind of keep going and keep I'm sure you're familiar with these terms. And then with regards to other stakeholders, I think it's key that we do work with them. And I find that sometimes universities become these third spaces where we try to engage them. And I think we should think about ways in which a lot of people are doing already. We can equip professionals with the tools to do this. So we, for example, teach strategic public management at our university. Now we teach strategic public management and branding, which includes strategic communication, because at the very least, we want them to understand that you have to deal with multiple stakeholders with different ways of talking about things. And it's not only understanding their different goals and missions and visions, but also their way they are putting them out, and how you can talk to them and how you can understand what underpins their action. So I think it's very important that we do this. We don't have all the answers, but that is definitely very important. And this is something we also working very closely in my department. We last November held a workshop called Co-Creation. So we worked with practitioners and academics to talk about co-creation, what it means and how we can better do it. And this was a lot in the discussion. How we can talk to different people, how we can make people heard, because it's not only a democratic right to be heard, if we think about places in particular, but also it is so important so you can do your work, develop your policies in a way that we actually have good impact. I don't like the word impact, but you know, it will bring the results that or the change that you want towards more sustainable practices or other aspects of sustainability. I think it's really key, and communication is, in my view, in our view, really important in this process.
Amazing.
I hope I answered your question somehow, Victoria, but if not, please let us know.
No, I think that's Victoria says yes.
Great.
It's interesting that you don't like the term impact. I'm struggling with it as well. Sometimes I use the word resonance. So at least that you can see that it resonates, but it's a bit more open. So it doesn't mean kind of measurable impact, but okay, there was something in it that you have like a response, in what way ever. And I think this is also something why you need those spaces or those alternative public spheres or those conversational spaces, because only then you can kind of keep the resonance within the process and don't lose it. If you send information to someone, then the resonance kind of is something that's really hard to not just measure, but also include in the process, but if you think about it more co-creational, then you include the resonance. And that is something that I find really helpful in getting beyond this term of impact. But I know what you mean, and somehow we need to this idea of well, things need to change.
We had conversations with colleagues because the term greenwashing, it's really understood by everybody, but there's also impact washing.
Yes.
At least what we do at a university level, but we have to be critical about that, right? So what does it mean? But it goes back to really understanding what are we set to do? What are the values that we are upholding? Yes. And I know I'm preaching the same, but I think ultimately it comes down to, do I think about externalities of my work? Because you could talk anything. You could talk sustainability with generative AI. We had a discussion yesterday about this, generative AI in education, and we talk ethics, we talk how we're going to assess our students, but someone actually brought the question up. So how about the unsustainability of keeping generators running, for keeping the data, and then I think it's embedded in everything we do. So in my view, communicating for sustainability is key for any organization, group, place. I look at it from a place perspective, but actually use organizational studies theory to kind of put a framework in the way we have multiple stakeholders in a place. Is beyond governments. It's how we arrange this action towards sustainability. And again, communication, in my view, is really key. And how we enable different voices through creating either public spheres in the formal processes, and also, of course, it would be great to have media that are able to become more free to maybe less tied into these demands of the commercial press, and being able to report, watchdog, help elevate those voices. But we know the landscape is complicated. So maybe we can do something about creating those spaces or fostering some kind of public spheres where people can really discuss what values sustainability has for them. I think that's very important.
Love that. Since we kind of went, we extended this conversation to nearly an hour, and I'm so grateful because I learned so much. But I want to kind of take this as a final statement and stop the recording here with saying like a massive thank you. It was a delight to talk to you. I was, as I said, I'm very intrigued to kind of think in those different directions and enter those new rooms of thinking that you opened up for all of us. Thank you so much
for having me. I also learned a lot, and thanks, Victoria, for your great question.